And you can already see that large elements of the left would be completely supportive, particularly of enfranchising foreigners. This would actually get support of probably at least 15% of the current electorate, maybe 20% of the current electorate. The same 20% who would say, join the euro tomorrow, give the UN control of the British Army, et cetera, et cetera. That 20% would support giving, like 100 million Somalis and 100 million Pakistanis and 100 million guys from the Congo the vote. They'd say, yes, great, this is the future of democracy.
So obviously the Conservatives have been very vocal around issues that Starmer has failed on. Things like illegal migration, legal migration, the Online Safety Act and so on.
Actually, not the last one, I think, interestingly, right? Yeah, actually, somewhat tumbleweed on the Online Safety Act. And I think that points to a broader issue, which is, as many people have said to me inside the Tory party the last couple of days, when I've said, why are you not pushing on this more? The answer from Kemi's office is, well, many of the MPs regard this as actually a success, one of the things that we should be pleased with. That's what they were all told at the time, right? They were programmed with the idea. And I think that obviously is, I've talked to a few of your colleagues who've been interviewing people, and they've been probing around, why can't you get like obvious answers out of this? And I think that's the obvious reason. But it shows this broader thing, right? It's a bit similar to the Afghan debacle, and Wallace and co coming out on TV and saying, oh, I'm extremely proud of it. Like, they just don't get it. They actually think that a lot of these things that they did, which the voters think are insane, they actually really believe in still. So immigration, cleverly defends the Boriswave, the Afghan horror, Wallace defends that, online safety, Kemi's in favour of it, etc., etc.
Well, Priti Patel came out and defended the Boriswave in an interview, I think, last year.
Yeah.
And there was no repercussions for her in terms of her position in the shadow cabinet, which is interesting. Do you think that voters will forget just exactly what Boris Johnson did in terms of migration, the Conservatives did on migration, and all of these other issues that we're talking about?
No, of course not. And anyone who's doing focus groups now knows that they haven't forgotten. And everyone who's doing focus groups now knows that as soon as you start, if you put videos up saying, oh, well, now the new leader of the Conservative Party says blah, people say immediately and quite understandably, yeah, but they just did the opposite for 14 years, so why would I believe that? And that's a fundamental problem for them, which they don't have an answer to at the moment, and may not get one.
When you say they don't have an answer, there has been some speculation in the press. They call it smashing the emergency glass to bring back Boris. Now, what do you make of this option for the Tories?
So, you're dealing with, you have a party which is completely wrecked at a local level, completely disintegrated. Your activists have either retired or deserted to your main opponent, Nigel Farage. You have resuscitated Farage from retirement to leading in the polls. And the fundamental reason why is because you had multiple years of by far the greatest collapse of border control in 1,000 years of British history. And you think the answer to that is to bring back the guy who did it and who is on the record on dozens and dozens and dozens of occasions defending it and explaining why it was a good idea? I mean, few people have been as critical of the Conservative Party as me, and few people have said as much as I have that no idiocy is beyond them. But it would be fairly dramatic even for the Conservative Party to think that in a political environment dominated by their own failure over immigration, you put forward in 2028 the guy who's responsible for the problem.
When it comes to very emotive issues that have caused protests and riots around the country, particularly in relation to illegal migration, I'll give you one example. I interviewed recently a victim of a rape by an illegal migrant who was staying in a migrant hotel in Oxford. This young girl, she was only 20 at the time, just the most horrible, horrific story you can imagine, has destroyed parts of her life, her family's life and so on. When it comes to holding the people who were responsible for this accountable, what would you recommend? Do you think that a Farage government or whoever, if they do replace Starmer, should sort of open investigations into these people, into the politicians, into the civil service? I mean, that's just one example of many terrible examples of what's happened. And I suppose a sort of adjacent question to that is, do you think it was a political decision to allow this situation to happen? You're always saying this is the system working as intended.
So on the second thing first, right, you have to separate out different things. Number one, obviously it was an explicit political decision by Boris when he was Prime Minister in 2021 to reverse ferret on everything that we said we would do in 2019 election and what we started to do in the first quarter of 2020. In 2021, he took an explicit decision to do the opposite of that and to open the floodgates on the whole thing. Secondly, there has been a clear cross-party consensus for multiple decades in support of membership of the European Convention of Human Rights and support for keeping the Human Rights Act, which enshrines it in domestic law. Now, the second of these two things, the ECHR and Human Rights Act, have thousands of consequences across public policy, but they are particularly important when it comes to dealing with illegal immigration, to dealing with deportation, which the ECHR now is effectively banned to a whole set of countries and a growing list of countries. And that consensus has been extremely strong for 20 odd years. On the first question, going back to your first point about investigations, like clearly if you have a serious regime that's determined to try and turn the page on this disastrous chapter, on all sorts of things, a new regime has to open the books and come to clean with people about what's been happening. At the end of 2022, subsequently was reported that at the time it was secret, I had these secret conversations with Rishi Sunak about potentially going back to number 10 and trying to turn the whole disaster around. And one of the things I said to him then is, you should declassify a whole bunch of information which you and I, i.e. me and Rishi, have seen in classified documents, but which is kept very, very dark from most of the cabinet, never mind the rest of the MPs and the public, about the precise effects of the ECHR and a whole bunch of national security issues. He declined. He said that, oh, of course, the system would go crazy if you did that, etc. But if you're going to have a regime which actually is serious about reversing course on this whole set of things, of course that involves, like the grooming gang stuff, right? It involves coming clean, it involves mass publication, it involves dropping thousands of these documents out on the internet for open scrutiny, and it involves a reckoning for both the old parties and the old Whitehall with a new kind of transparency and openness. And then, right, here's what happened, here's why it was a disaster, here's some nitty-gritty detail of why it worked out the way it did, and this is why we're going to go now in a completely new direction.
When it comes to the intelligence services, how much power do they have that the British public or even MPs and so on don't understand? Are they kind of more powerful than it is understood in the public? And do you think that, again, a new government should be concerned about the intelligence services kind of going after them? You've talked in your recent blog about deep state plans to try and embroil Farage, for example, in lots of investigations and various other problems for him that they did to Trump.
Very complicated set of things. I think, number one, relative to most countries, the overwhelming number of countries, I think we're very lucky in this country that we have far fewer problems with the intelligence services than other countries have had. If, for example, you look at the history of the CIA back to its creation after World War II, America's had far more profound problems. And is still living with that, right? You just in the last few months, even you've seen interesting things about finally publication of various CIA documents about their knowledge of Oswald from about 1959 onwards. So a huge issue there, huge issue in the whole Russiagate hoax, obviously after 2016, where elements of intelligence services there helped the Democrats create this completely fake story about how Facebook advertising worked. So relative to that, Britain, I think, is in a very lucky situation. I think a more important question, now, inside intelligence services, there are always, of course, different factions and people with different ideas. Some of the people in those were very much in favour of Brexit and in favour of a very different kind of regime. Others took a very different attitude and were supportive of the old system. I think more important than that, though, is the way in which I think what people don't realise is, and I think most MPs don't realise this either, in the old days, the intelligence services were very directly controlled by MPs. Now, not to the extent of Churchill's grasp of the detail and involvement with the detail in World War II, but still they were fundamentally controlled by political authorities very closely. What's happened now is that lots of the supervision and tasking and control of intelligence services has shifted to a thing called the National Security Secretariat, which is an office within the office of the Cabinet Office. And what's happened over the last 20 years is increasingly how the intelligence services operate has shifted to this thing, and then this thing has been taken out, this NSS entity inside the Cabinet Office has been taken out of not just the control of politicians, but even the visibility of politicians. So if you're now a special advisor or a minister and you say, well, I want to go to the following meetings of the NSS, I want to see how these decisions are taken, you'd be told very firmly, I'm sorry, Minister, that's not for political people. These meetings are what's called officials only. And I think that is a dangerous thing which has evolved. And a central way of fixing this has to be the general thing of restoring political control, restoring the control of political people who are directly responsible to Parliament for what's going on. That's a general thing which has failed in Britain over recent decades, the general collapse of the old ministerial responsibility to Parliament, which was central to the old British Constitution and has been destroyed step by step since 1945. In general, that needs to be restored, and it specifically needs to be restored regarding the National Security Secretariat inside the Cabinet Office and how the Cabinet Office works.
And obviously Blair accelerated a lot of this stuff with his kind of quangocracy and so-called depoliticisation of all sorts of issues into other outside bodies and so on.
He did, but to be fair to him, he was continuing a trend really begun mistakenly by Thatcher in the 80s. So a lot of these things started in the 80s when Conservatives made some profound misunderstandings about how things would develop. And they had a mistaken view that, well, if we take some of these things out of government departments, put them in these quangos, give them a specific mandate, then we can create kind of quasi-market systems in various ways, make things more responsive, more private sector, blah, 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 blah. Of course, the actual results of it were the exact opposite of what they intended. And the whole system moved in the opposite direction to what Thatcher thought it would do. So yes, Blair deserves some responsibility for that, but also, if you know, just in the interests of any kind of intellectual and political honesty, everyone has to face that this is a long-term trend that predates Blair.
We're currently in Hungary, bordering Ukraine. Ukraine has been a huge issue in Hungarian politics, more so than in Britain. And I know that you've written a lot about Ukraine and Britain's policy towards Ukraine, maybe linking this in with the intelligence services, the MOD and so on. Why do you think Britain was so uniquely pro-Ukraine from the very beginning?
Ooh, another complicated question. Well, one part of it obviously was that Boris was in a profound political crisis of his own, and he correctly thought, if we ratchet up all the war talk, then that will distract the media. The London media can only cope with one big story at a time. And therefore, if war is the dominant story, then all of my shenanigans and illegalities over wallpaper and Partygate and all of that, it will necessarily have to vanish from a lot of the media. And of course, his calculation was correct, because once the war kicked off in January, February, it did knock up a huge amount of the story away for months to come. So his cynicism about the British media was vindicated. Another big factor, obviously, is that, kind of touching on what we said before, it's crucial to remember that large parts of the establishment system across the Western world fell hook, line and sinker for the Russiagate hoax, right? So Jake O'Sullivan, Ben Rhodes, elements of the intelligence services close to Hillary and Obama, etc., they created this story back in 2016 about Brexit and Trump, and all of this was secretly all being coordinated, and me and Steve Bannon were all working together through Cambridge Analytica, working with Putin, etc., etc., etc. This whole kind of
They literally made films about it.
Yeah. This whole conspiracy theory. But it was a conspiracy theory which kind of got out of control because then it ended up being believed by large elements of the Democrat Party and Westminster, even though, and of course, another ironic effect of it was, it kind of fractured Silicon Valley's support for the Democrats. Before this, Silicon Valley was almost completely behind the Democrat Party. But once the Russiagate thing got going, a whole bunch of people in Silicon Valley had this then very extreme cognitive dissonance, right? Because they saw all these people saying, this is what happened, and this is how digital marketing works, this is how Facebook works. But all the people who actually do that professionally in Silicon Valley knew that the whole official story was complete garbage. And what the New York Times and the BBC and the Guardian and Channel 4 and everyone was saying about how Facebook worked was just complete fantasy land. So that had another effect in terms of fragmenting Silicon Valley support, another elite support for the establishment. So that was another factor. So you have a bunch of people essentially who mentally identified the war on Putin is the war on Trump. The two forces are kind of allied. I think that was it. And then the other huge force operating in the background, obviously, is you have 20 plus years in London now of completely fake MOD budgets, black holes, conventional black holes, and then the nuclear black hole, and then the nuclear black hole cannibalizing the already fake budgets and a kind of double fakery of the MOD. And the war was seen, unsurprisingly, by a large part of the intelligence services and the MOD as, well, here's a way for us to grab money and fill some of these black holes and get out of this budget nightmare. Of course, again, the exact opposite happened to what they wanted, because the money wasn't used to help them get out of the disaster. The money was then put into a whole bunch of stupid things that should have been cancelled, like Ajax tanks and a bunch of things that don't work. So in fact, it hasn't helped them solve the budgetary problems at all. It's actually made the budgetary problems worse. But that was their hope.
And obviously Ukraine is now facing a very difficult situation, and perhaps this is partly a result of British policy on this, which maybe goes under scrutinised. I know you talk about this a lot, so I need to move on. We haven't got much time. Tommy Robinson was more right than the mainstream on the grooming gangs, you said in your recent blog post.
Yeah.
Do you think that the British media have used Tommy Robinson as a kind of distraction, I guess, from some of these issues and obsessed over Tommy Robinson so much when, as you say, in some ways he's been vindicated on the rape gangs?
So I don't know a lot of the detail on this, particularly on Robinson himself over the last whatever it is, 10, 20 years. But I mean, anyone who looks at a whole bunch of clips just on the internet, right, of how he was interviewed about this story 10, 20 years ago, it's just an unavoidable fact that him and other people regarded as outside the mainstream and talking conspiracy theories and everything else, including a lot of Labour MPs who said very similar things. I've forgotten her name now, but there was an MP very early, 20 plus years ago, a Labour woman who raised this issue, and she was attacked in the same way as racist, conspiracy theorists, etc., etc. So it's just an unarguable fact that a lot of people raised this, a lot of people were shouted down as racist and conspiracy theories, and now we can see what the truth of it is. But as usual, Westminster is very bad at facing the reality on this, and it tends to prefer just to kind of move on to a new story, similar on Ukraine, right? No one's facing up to the complete failure of the whole Western policy. It's just kind of disappeared from the news.
Coming back to the Online Safety Act, obviously millions of Brits have seen their internet being censored or asked for their ID and all that. But
yeah.
Labour have come back fighting on this against Farage and said that you're basically supporting Jimmy Savile. What do you make of that line of argument from Number 10?
I mean, given Keir Starmer's previous role in the DPP, given Labour's role in the cover-up all over the country on the grooming gangs, it's just obviously more completely self-inflicted disaster for Number 10, right? It's not a smart move, but that just reflects the fact that Number 10 Communications has imploded in general. They've got no story, they've got a non-functioning Prime Minister, they have no actual plan for government, they're facing a budget with a Treasury scorecard going redder and redder, they've got a non-functioning Chancellor, they have effectively no political strategy because they've blown up McSweeney's plan. So overall, I think it's a kind of consequence of the collapse of the government, but it's a broader thing on this online safety thing, right? As the old regimes are failing, what they're turning to increasingly, they can't face that we're failing and the public hate us, so let's face reality, right? They have to always come up with some alternative fake world to move to next. And so the thing at which they're moving to across the Western world is, oh, it's far-right disinformation, and that means we have to move back towards old ideas of censorship, often old ideas predating World War II or even pre-World War I. And in this, again, you see the kind of downstream effects of American culture. So if you'd said 10 years ago, the official candidates to be Democrat president will be saying in the week before the 2024 election that the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech was, quote, a historic error which we will fix after the election, unquote. Everyone from the right to the left to everyone in between and all mainstream would have said that's completely lunatic. Like, the idea of attacking the First Amendment is insane. There's no way that could possibly be true. But both Hillary and John Kerry did that in the week before the 2024 election. And what that tells you is that the forces that gave you Russiagate are not just going to admit, okay, we failed. They're increasingly going to shift their attention to how do you control the whole technology stack so that we can essentially reimpose censorship and reimpose narrative control. And they're also being terrified by the fact that they're now looking at all this market research coming out on Gen Z and realizing, oh, the story that we've told ourselves for years about how the future is just the relentless march left. Well, Gen Z is completely fragmenting, and a large part, particularly of male Gen Z, is actually going in an opposite direction and is more to the right of any other demographic. This is clearly a disaster, so narrative control must be reimposed.
Again, quoting from your blog, the reform people are way overconfident. They are ahead because everyone has collapsed, not because they have a great team. You describe members of their team as morons, and something even worse, which I won't mention. At some point, somebody will put them under pressure. They cannot sustain focus. Is this sort of from personal experience? Like, how do you know what's going on in reform? Have you got good contacts there? Can you just assess how you see them?
Well, I think you don't need to have internal sources, right? You can just see for oneself. Have they gone out and hired a whole bunch of great people to do policy, to do research, to do all kinds of things? Have they embarked on a candidate selection process for MPs and to find ministers? No. Now, I think Farage himself was aware of this, and when I even discussed this with him when I had dinner with him at Christmas time. So I think Nigel is aware of this issue. He knows what the public want to see, which is a concerted effort by reform to reach out and start recruiting talent. But of course, that is it's difficult, it's complicated, it's messy. It involves inevitably a loss of control, right? If you're a one-man band with an iPhone and then you start shifting to recruiting dozens of people, then hundreds of people, it's inherently a process whereby you have to give up some control, because if you don't give up control and you're just going to run everything, then you're only going to recruit idiots, right? You're not going to recruit a whole bunch of great people and then just say, well, you're all just puppets who have to repeat whatever I say. So there's an inherent tension between growing, recruiting, doing what you need to do in order to be able to go into number 10 and actually control the government, which means having hundreds of people in the system that can actually control the instruments of power. That's an inherently difficult thing to do, and I think he's aware of the problem, but so far has not set out a plan for how to deal with it. Hopefully he will do.
Again, from your blog, you're talking about a few officials have suggested to me this playbook for Whitehall, using a useless Starmer administration as puppets, enfranchise 16-year-olds, enfranchise millions of EU nationals, go after reform donors and attack their financial infrastructure, use the intelligence services to embroil Farage in scandals, criminal cases and so on, and the same for a new Tory leader if they emerge and are successful. Do you seriously expect that to happen? Is that something you're concerned about? And how should Farage and everyone respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think you can see this playbook. It's been deployed in the EU quite a few times, right? And I was talking to someone a couple of hours ago who said that in Brussels, in the Commission building now, they refer to it as with the beautifully Orwellian title of building. What did he say it was called? The Democracy Shield. I think they called it. The new Brussels plan for censorship is going to be called Democracy Shield or something similar, which is kind of appropriate for them. You've seen members of the European Commission say openly on the news, well, we've prevented various people being elected in various countries before, and we'll do the same thing with the AfD in Germany, and we'll do the same thing wherever we need to. So in Brussels, they are, of course, much more open about this. They're not embarrassed really about, given the fundamental premise of the whole EU project is intrinsically and deliberately and explicitly anti-democratic, they're obviously not really worried about admitting a lot of these things. But there's an obvious model there for elements of Whitehall to try to copy. And you can already see that large elements of the left would be completely supportive, particularly of enfranchising foreigners. This would actually get support of probably at least 15% of the current electorate, maybe 20% of the current electorate. The same 20% who would say, join the euro tomorrow, give the UN control of the British Army, etc. That 20% would support giving, like 100 million Somalis and 100 million Pakistanis and 100 million guys from the Congo the vote. They'd say, yes, great, this is the future of democracy. So there's clearly going to be pressure from the left to do that. And it is a somewhat attractive solution for them, because if you're faced with the nightmare of the old party system crumbling and some insurgent force taking over, many people in Whitehall would much rather deal with the possible blowback of trying to cheat the system like that than they would with losing power.
And is there anything Farage can do to prevent this stuff from embroiling him and sort of defending himself?
The most important thing is what we already discussed, which is, have you got great people? If you've got great people, then you can turn lots of these things there to your advantage, right? In the referendum, the government and Whitehall tried all kinds of things, but because I'd hired some great people, we could kind of jujitsu a lot of it back on them, and a lot of the things they tried to do didn't work. Similarly, in summer 2019, when we were dealing with a large element of Westminster that was effectively on the side of Brussels against the British voters, because we had great people, we could flip things around. So the crucial thing for Farage is, if you've got a great team, then a lot of this kind of moves from the system can actually be jujitsu'd back and can blow them up and cause them trouble. But if you haven't got great people, you're going to be under a lot of pressure, and it's going to be very hard for you.
Now, you've written recently about William Pitt the Younger. There's this fantastic book, Napoleon Against Britain, which talks all about the coalitions that he was creating, but also his fantastic kind of bureaucratic expertise, his administrative expertise and so on. Do you think Pitt the Younger was the best Prime Minister we've had? Do you think he's someone, obviously, that people should look up to and model themselves upon? And other British Prime Ministers you think are seriously impressive? I presume Winston Churchill's up there as well.
So I think so I would slightly separate out the categories in a way. I think in terms of someone with a kind of a mix of incredible intelligence, incredible insight, and an ability to maneuver the political system and make it high performing. I think from that kind of combination of skills, I think it's hard to think of anyone in the history of the British Prime Minister job who's done it better than Pitt. I think for sure, if you compare, like organising Whitehall and how to run meetings and things like that, Pitt was the best at it, I think. But I would also say, in another way, Churchill, in a sense, was a greater hero and arguably more important for the history of the world. If you go back and read Alan Brooks' memoirs and other memoirs of the time, you realise that Churchill was in various ways aggravating administratively. He wasn't the best person at understanding how these bureaucracies worked. wasn't the best person to kind of try and direct them, and sometimes came up with genuinely bad ideas. But he also had some kind of instinctive genius that put him above, that kind of rendered all of that kind of secondary. And because he was great at putting people like Alan Brooke in place, Britain ended up getting kind of the best of all worlds, right? Because it had this extraordinary kind of mythic person who regarded himself as embodying some kind of destiny of Britain to save the world, whilst at the same time picking people like Alan Brooke to actually run the general staff, etc., etc. So we kind of got lucky with that, I think, in various ways. But lucky we got the best of all worlds from it, because you had this emotional leadership, spiritual force in Churchill that enabled resistance at a hinge moment for the world, when so many sensible people were saying, look, like, even if it's just temporary, tactical, we've got to do some kind of deal and like buy ourselves breathing space. And he was the one person who could kind of like rouse the nation to an effort to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're actually just going to fight on alone, and here's how we're going to turn the thing around, and actually take everyone with him and make it work. So I think Pitt and Churchill are the two big ones.
Gladstone, Salisbury, Disraeli, Baldwin, Pitt the Elder.
Salisbury also great in various ways, different kind of character though, very kind of cool-blooded, a certain kind of very cold, calculating aristocrat of the old school. Last such character we've had really in one of those in the top job. But I think those two are the big two.
And where do we rank Starmer and Boris and Liz and all these people, the recent ones?
Well, when you sort of list all of these characters recently, right, John Major, Cameron, Truss and Boris and whatnot, it just shows how far we've fallen, doesn't it? But it goes back to this central cultural thing of how all through history, elite talent inevitably in the past went into public service. A lot of elite talent went into public service, militaries, intelligence services and whatnot. A unique and weird thing about the West in the last few decades has been the way in which that kind of stopped, and almost all elite talent kind of went off into to other spheres. They went some combination of maths, money, computing. They work in investment banking, hedge funds, VC, tech companies, scientific research, etc., etc. And therefore the caliber of the people at the top of these institutions, both the political party institutions and civil service institutions, imploded. And that's at the heart of the kind of multiple disasters that we're seeing now.
And Starmer himself, obviously you're not impressed with him as a politician, I presume, obviously his lawyer background and so on. How long do you think he's got?
I had sort of assumed that the Labour Party doesn't get rid of people, and these kind of heuristics are quite sticky historically, but I now think as this old system really crumbles, maybe these old rules of thumb become less important. Strikes me as more and more likely that he's removed, and that Rayner takes over. He can't do the job, he doesn't understand the job, he doesn't like the job, he can't face reality. He's got, of course, there are always some great officials around the British system, particularly in private office, but overall he's dealing with the same kind of collapse of standards as everyone else has been dealing with. So he's not going to turn things around. And of course, they're heading for a budget where the Treasury scorecard gets worse and worse every week, flashes more and more red, and you've got a non-functioning Chancellor. So the system is saying, well, there's no option but just very depressing budget for everyone, more taxes, cut spending, more Treasury vandalism of every long-term capital budget, et cetera, et cetera. So I increasingly think that the budget will be a disaster, and then they'll get rid of Reeves, and then McSweeney will go, and the Prime Minister's own authority will be under extreme scrutiny. And I wouldn't surprise me at all if they ended up just going for Rayner, because most Labour MPs, right, live in a parallel world. They worked in some like lefty NGO charity. They've got very, very tenuous connection to any kind of reality outside London. And they just want a left-wing government. So there's a lot of logic for them in just putting Rayner in and saying, do a wealth tax, make the billionaires pay their fair share, and that's how we'll balance the books.
We're talking about this kind of left-wing populism. What do you make of this Corbyn party, this new party that may emerge? Do you think should we take them seriously?
I mean, it depends what you mean by seriously. There's no doubt that they could take millions of votes away from the Labour Party, but then that's because Labour Party's... The 2024 coalition was a completely negative coalition. It wasn't a positive coalition for any kind of plan from Starmer, and it wasn't a vote of confidence in Starmer's own leadership, right? It was we completely loathe and detest the appalling Tories. We're completely sick of them. They must go. But Starmer is now doing to that coalition exactly what Boris did to the 2019 coalition, which is machine gun systematically every single bit of it. So everybody is unhappy, and they're leaking votes to everybody apart from the old Conservative Party.
Dominic Cummings, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure,
Appreciate
thank you.
it.
Cheers.